Welcome back to hour two of Nothing Personal. Today is Tuesday, July 22nd, 2025. And you know what Tuesday means. That means we have a guest. And today we have the perfect guest. You may know him as Evan Drellich. You may know him as the writer of the book Winning Fixes Everything. Or you may know him as the senior writer at The Athletic. Or you may have read his story just yesterday about the Commissioner's Ambassador Program. Totally prescient. Please welcome Evan to the show. How are you, Evan?
David, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Well, I assume you're booked like crazy because you drop a what used to be known as a Woj bomb, and you cover labor, some of really the best in the business, I would say, and we're going to get to that. But you wrote an article yesterday that came out in The Athletic, and again, I tell our audience, if you're not subscribing to The Athletic, you're making a mistake. The juice is way worth the squeeze. The writers they have, the reporting they do, what they do. We've talked about paywalls. This is a critical part of journalism today. And you decided that it was time to get to the bottom of Dexter Fowler and CC Sabathia et al. Tell our audience a little bit about what you found, what you wrote, and why it's become such a huge story.
Well, listen, the participants kind of made this easy for me because they went public. They were on a different program on Foul Territory. There'd been some conversation that existed. And I love doing things on the record these days. Not everything I do is on the record, but I love when people are out there putting their name to things. And this was stuff that was out there. The Players Union, for some time now, has been not up in arms, but irritated by the number of ex-players that the commissioner's office has hired and brought in to work for it. It's a better roster than the union has, and that's no knock, no offense on what the union does have. But they've got this group of all-stars. I mean, if you're putting a fantasy baseball team together, around the year 2012, this is a great group of guys that they have. And what's really irking the union is that some of these guys, not all of them, some of them are going with the commissioner to these annual visits that he's holding with every team. And he's talking to the teams about economics. He's trying to, it seems, push for a salary cap. And the union thinks, well, some of these guys that the commissioner is bringing along with him, they might be pushing for a cap too. And, a guy like CC Sabathia holds a role with the commissioner's office beyond this ambassador program. So he's a more frequent participant. But it's a really interesting thing. You zoom out. You have a players union, and then you have a commissioner's office that's saying, we're just going to recreate or create a different group of players that's going to liaison with your players. And there's good purposes to it. It makes a lot of sense for the commissioner's office. They took a lot of heat for not connecting with players well enough, but it's a very interesting added wrinkle to the already complicated labor dynamics in baseball.
You didn't call me for this story because if you had, I would have gone on the record to tell you what the background is of the Commissioner's Ambassador Program, because one of the people involved with it is Mike Hill, and it has been going on for years, even before the last CBA, where they wanted what teams do. Every team does this. We've got special assistants to the owner, special assistants to the president, special assistants to the general manager. You bring back players, alums of your team, well-known, maybe Hall of Famers. I had Andre Dawson and Tony Perez, and you bring them in for several reasons. One, community appearances. Two, you want them around the players because you want the players to have the fountain of information and experience that these players have to draw on. So you may dress them during BP. They're watching games with us, and then they're in the clubhouse. Basically, the purpose of it is almost like credibility, bought instant credibility when you have these players around. But not one time, not once, did we say to one of our players who were now special assistants, hey, we're having an issue with these games in Puerto Rico. We're having an issue with scheduling a doubleheader, or all of the labor things that come up during the course of a season. Not once do we say to those players, Andre or Tony or Niner or anybody, hey, go speak to the guys. You got to go get those guys to do something. The commissioner does not need anybody in the ambassador program to do anything as it relates to labor. And the reason, Evan, is that they go against Tony and Bruce, the two heads of the union, and they've got that. They don't need the players in the ambassador program to attempt to get information to players. They're doing just fine without them. So I thought this whole story was a big nothing burger. And when Tony and Bruce get upset on foul territory, the commissioner loves that because it distracts them from really what matters.
Yeah, look, certainly the position of everybody I've talked to at the commissioner's office, and I was able to talk off record with some of these guys who were part of the program, but nobody wanted to be quoted. What they're saying is, look, we want to help grow the game. This was Dexter Fowler, who was on foul territory's big point is, I'm not here to pick sides. And I think it is it's an aggressive assumption to believe that the commissioner's office would hire a group that is now 19 and say to each one of them, you have to be indoctrinated into our bargaining beliefs, and you have to then spread those bargaining beliefs. And I don't think the union actually believes that. I think there's a smaller group of guys that the union is a little bit more leery of because they seem to pop up more in these meetings. But look, a lot of these guys are not going to every one of these meetings, and they're showing up at All-Star games, they're showing up at different league events. And you're right, credibility is the word. And Rob Manfred took a lot of heat during the last round of bargaining and really over the tenure of his commissionership for not having good enough relationships with players. So he goes out and he gets this whole group of not nobody players. I mean, these are all stars who he can bounce ideas off of, who he can bring to events. If you're going to a community event, wouldn't you love to see a guy like CC Sabathia
or Ken Griffey?
Right, and it's a long list of great players, and it's a very touchy, complicated thing because anytime you have a perception when there's a union involved, well, are people getting too close to management? Are you sidestepping the union? You get into all this nuance that has to do with labor relations, and you just have these guys that seem to be in the middle going, look, I'm not really about that. I'm here to try to grow baseball, and look, I get free flights to the All-Star game. Isn't that fun?
I would say that if Rob ever hired Max Scherzer, then I would be concerned that there was something amiss going on, though I don't really see that happening. But I think that Rob, what he's doing, and my history with Rob, and I tell the audience this, there's always a disclaimer that I was involved when he was voted as the next commissioner, but he wants to be cool. And he actually yesterday went on Pardon My Take. And his view is, I love having these players around who can be front facing. Truly, the word is ambassadors to the game, because whenever I'm in a room, I don't want people looking at me. I'd rather people oogling over the players. And when I show up and I've got Ken Griffey on my left arm and I've got CC Sabathia on my right arm, it's better than Elle Macpherson and Cheryl Teagues, which just shows my age a little bit. But this is exactly what Rob wanted to do. And I am just laughing to myself about the union focusing on this when you're about to start a stretch that is just going to be insane in terms of covering the real collective bargaining negotiations that are going on outside of the ambassador program. And frankly, outside of Rob, it's going to be Dan Hallam and a few specific owners. What is your mindset in terms of going into this set of bargaining right now?
Well, this is why it is interesting and why it's still somewhat relevant, because if you're Rob and you have a group of owners who want you to push for a salary cap, and I think it's safe to sit here today and assume that there's going to be a proposal for a salary cap. I'm not reporting this as a firm decision that the commissioner's office has made. I just think it's a reasonable assumption at this point that they're going to try. And it's the thing that for all of time, the players in this sport have fought against. Well, then why don't you pull out all the stops? You try everything you can to lay the groundwork, because the only way you're going to get a cap is if you convince enough players that it's good for them, that it is better for them than the current system, that they should make a change and ignore what the leaders at their union are saying. And so you're right, David, that what's going on in cap is really kind of small fish in the bigger picture. But it's also a little bit of a nothing to lose play, where you're up against a pretty big fight here, that it's relatively unlikely, but not impossible. And so if you can convince some young players with a guy like CC Sabathia, that, there's merit to this system that all the other sports have, but baseball players have always stood against. There's some value in that, right? And I think
But there's a bigger issue, Evan, because go back and remind everyone, or I'll do it with you, the vote that ratified the CBA was voted for. Here's how it works. It's not every player who gets a vote. It's 30 team reps plus the 9 members, I believe is the number of the executive council of the union. There's 39 total votes. And what happened was all of Boris's guys on the council voted against the CBA that was actually ended up being ratified. But the team reps all voted for it because younger players, not yet arbitration eligible, watching a year of their career pass, about to miss a check, don't want to get a second job, which they had to do as minor leaguers. So already there is precedent where talking to the players, making sure they understand what is the actual negotiated CBA, that's going to win the day more than all of the posturing that Tony and his group that they do.
Yeah, and it's 38. And look, I think the push for a cap is a very interesting thing. You can argue that with a federal investigation going on, and one of the people who was connected to that investigation, Lloyd Howell, the head of the NFL Players Union, just stepping aside, the Players Union is not at its strongest in its history at this moment. There's just no way around that. And it's interesting that the salary cap is the one issue that has always galvanized players. And I think you can argue that the best strategy would not to be to give the thing that kind of unites players or has historically united players. It would be to find something else. And so what I think is going to happen here, if I'm in the prediction business, we're going to have another offseason lockout by 2026, the end of 2026. This will be probably $13 billion in the industry. Let's say it's roughly split between the two sides, $6.5 billion a year each to the players, to the owners. It's going to be the exact same thing as last time. If there are missed games, it'll be a few missed games at most. There's no world in which it is a rational decision to shut down the sport, if that is what is necessary, for a prolonged period of time to get to a cap. The owners want their franchise values to look more like they do in the NBA and NFL. To get that, they need to get a cap. The damage you do, the revenues you lose in that path, assuming the players don't just say, okay, we'll do it. I just don't see it as being worth it. And if we didn't see games missed last time, after the players were angry for 10 years, didn't miss a single game, I just can't imagine we're going to go, well, we're selling our franchises for $2 billion instead of 3.2. And boy, that's worth missing $6.5 billion in annual revenue for. I just don't see it.
Well, I think that there's another side to it, Evan, though, which is when I was around for the CBAs during my 18 years, we never had a group of 8 owners who were together, who were what they were called labor hawks. Jerry Reinsdorf is the number one example. The labor hawk, meaning that he always thought the deals were bad, he wanted to hold out, was willing to shut down the game, and wanted to get in line the economic disparities that exist, especially in his own city. So he was always a labor hawk. You didn't have 8 of them. What you have now, though, is a bunch of owners who don't owe Bud Selig any favors. And that was a huge thing back then, where Bud had a lot of control over the room. The room is really different now. And I'm not saying Rob doesn't have control. What I am saying is that Rob plays a different game than Bud does. And Rob is counting always to 23 and trying to make sure there aren't blocks of 8. But if there is a block of 8, which this time there could be, that's what would make more missed games. Because when you say $6.5 billion, that's if you lose an entire season of revenue. But the fact is, these teams don't trade on multiples of revenue ever, no matter what Forbes says. They trade on an ego premium. And so if there is a way to get the costs better under control, which means getting the contracts at the upper and lower in terms of number of years, in terms of what the total notional value is, and you've got to sacrifice games, and a lot of them, you may have 8 owners this time who are willing to do it.
I think the 8 owners who would want it most are the small market guys. And I think they're the 8 owners who would also be hurt the most. And the wild card for me, that's why I think it's important for Rob to, you show these guys you did it. You try. Look, I tried. I put a cap on the table and we stood firm on this for months. It's February now. We're getting to the point that's what I think is going to happen. I think Rob is going to wait as long as he can on a cap proposal.
Does it remind you of something from earlier this century called contraction? Where contraction
didn't happen, right?
I don't know if you were around. Were you around in
I was a
2000,
little guy.
2001?
I was a little guy.
Yeah, you're so young. So contraction was a major, major labor issue where they wanted to get rid of two teams, the Expos and the Twins. And at one point, the Marlins may have been one of the teams, but one of the teams was the Twins. Back when Carl Pohlad was the richest owner in the game, the owner of the Twins, and that was the team that was going to be contracted. And it was one of those deals that was put on the table, and MLB stood in. They stood their ground. They stood their ground, and then it disappeared. And contraction was always a bargaining chip. And so what you're hoping is the salary cap will again be a bargaining chip. The difference now is that in that room of owners, they look at the other leagues and the franchise valuations. And they understand that the NBA has caps on contracts, contract lengths, age of the player matters. NFL does not have fully guaranteed dollars the way MLB does. And all of these players, Evan, which we don't even have time to talk about, getting paid to be all-stars when they're not all-stars. When the fact is, when they stink, we don't get any money back. Management never gets any money back. What worries me about the length of this lockout is you may have owners who say it's actually totally worth it because our only chance of increasing the value of our team is if we have hope in our market. And the only way to have hope is not to have the difference between the Marlins and the Dodgers because the other leagues don't have that. You'll still have rebuilding teams. You'll still have stinky teams, but the collar is way smaller than what exists in baseball.
The wild card to me, and I'm not saying that's impossible. This might shock some people, but as a reporter for The Athletic, I'm not a billionaire. So I really don't know exactly how they think. But you've new owners, David Rubenstein, Steve Cohen. What do those guys want? You buy into baseball to be in the club and to be loved, particularly a guy like Steve Cohen, whose business past checkered, right? You want the adulation that you've received. If you shut down baseball and you do it for an extended length of time, there goes that love that you were trying to gain. That it's really the one thing you can't buy. He can buy as many pointing man sculptures as he wants, but you can't buy the love. And so I don't know. I have no idea if those owners would sit there and go, I want to be hated for a year or potentially longer than that. And I think that's one of the things we've got to see, and we've got to see how effective MLB's ground campaign is at the end of the day at getting the players and saying a cap is better for you. And the one thing we haven't talked about that I think the commissioner's office would say how you're missing the big thing here is the media environment. The attempt to centralize more local rights, to take more local rights national, which is all a part of the cap. You want more media to be national, so you need to change revenue sharing, and that's where a cap becomes a part of it. And it's mind-numbing stuff for a lot of people, but there's a very, very large set of TV deals coming up in 2028 that this CBA sets up, and the players have a lot of power to say, yeah, you can change revenue sharing or you can't.
But think about the timing. The new national deals, 28, the collective bargaining agreement for 27. If you miss a year, which I'm not saying they're going to do, but if you miss a year and you start again with new national deals, everyone knows the terms. Everyone knows what their piece is. Right now, you have owners. David Rubenstein's a great example. He actually went public, which is something under Bud we were never allowed to do ever. He'd fly in from Milwaukee and pour Diet Coke on our head if we ever talked labor publicly. David Rubenstein's been out there saying, hey, this is not right. And you talk about beloved. He's not beloved in Baltimore. Steve Cohen is only beloved when the team wins. They go 11-21 over a stretch of 3 weeks, and all of a sudden it's, hey, what's going on with these Mets? So it's not that fans necessarily are all about just spend money, spend money. It's spend money, and win. And if you don't have that opportunity to do either of those, then it may be worth it to actually take a stand.
I am of the look. I think the owners are kind of hurt by the fact that baseball is so random. Now, you haven't had a top 15 market team win the World Series since the Royals, but I think the playoffs are a crapshoot, right? The competitive balance. Here's the one argument that I think is really valid. You are never going to see a middle or small market team sign the absolute best player in free agency. The Kansas City Royals are never going to go out and sign Shohei Ohtani if he's available, right? But putting player preferences aside, it's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean to me that those teams that can't sign those guys will not compete. And that the heart of the issue that the commissioner's office is going to appeal to fans with is we can't compete, we can't compete. It's just not true, right? This sport is so random. All you have to do is get into the playoffs and see what happens. There's a reason the Mets haven't won the World Series in however many years, right? You have a better chance as a big market team. But I think that's the irony of the whole thing, is that competitive balance could it be better? Sure, it could be. But could
every league says that, Evan.
Compete?
Every league says, hey, our competitive balance is great. And then Jason Stark, who you work with at The Athletic, does a column saying competitive balance. You're complaining about baseball? We've got the most competitive balance ever. We've got teams that are in the playoffs. And once you're in the playoffs, and I'm a shining example with our ring from '03, we needed so much luck that year to win the World Series. Every year a team does. I can't name the Dodgers starting pitchers from last World Series. Can you? Can you name the starters for games 1 through 4 that the Dodgers put out there last year's World Series?
No, I could tell you everybody in the labor relations department at the commissioner's office, though.
The point is that they had the big payroll, big market team. Oh my God, it's Dodgers, Yankees. Meanwhile, injuries galore. And I believe, and Coco will correct me, or our audience will, I think the Dodgers went with a bullpen game in the World Series, if I'm remembering correctly. Think about that concept for a minute. And what we're saying is what it takes to win. And to get into the playoffs, you've had small market teams in the playoffs every single year, whether it's the Brewers and how competitive they've been, the Rays, you've had the Royals, you've had the Guardians seem to be in the playoffs, the Twins. So to me, it's not necessarily about getting into the playoffs. It is the feeling that when you look at how you cover mistakes, and I don't know how to say it any more clearly, what the Dodgers can do that small market teams and small payroll teams can't is every time they make a mistake, and all teams make the same number of mistakes, but the Dodgers just keep going and signing more players and writing off the mistakes. But if you have a limit on what your payroll can be, what your cash flow is, you can't cover your mistakes. That's what the owners are trying to protect against.
Right. And, you look at the cap leagues, you still have franchise. Look, I grew up a Mets, Jets, and Knicks fan. I was born in 1987. Do you know how many World Series or championships I have seen in my lifetime?
So Mets 0, Jets 0, Knicks 0.
Right.
So wait, it turns out that you've seen 0.
Right. I've never seen a team I care about win anything. So maybe that explains a lot. But the point being, you get to a cap system. This is the thing. If let's make up numbers. Let's say you're at 300 million for the top, 200 million for the floor. Well, the Pirates, by the way, 200 million teams would revolt at that figure. But let's just pretend 200 million for the Pirates. They're gonna be there every year. They're never gonna go a penny above what they have to. It's gonna be the same setup where you have teams that are trying harder and some teams that aren't are spending more. And I think people look at it and go, well, finally, there's a cap. Our team is going to be in it every year. And I'm telling you, unless that band was so narrow that every team was at 250, which will never happen, it's not going to be the case. You're still going to have the haves and have-nots. It's not going to be this drastic thing in a random game. I'm going to tell you the best argument the league can make for a cap to players, which is we are going to do more for more of your members than you can possibly do in any near future. We're going to double the minimum salary.
And by the way, that's through the minimum. That's through increasing the minimum. That is critical.
We're going to triple the minimum salary.
Think about the impact. I remember when we were voting on what issues we cared about the most. The minimum goes up by $500,000. We've got 12 players at the minimum. Our payroll just went up $6 million before we even say a word, and we would always have 12 minimum guys on our team. So those things matter. That's why I think salary cap at the end, you're right, is going to be a red herring. But I do think that it will be used as part of a long work stoppage in order to get concessions even more so, because I think Tony and Bruce are just outmanned, and it's not because of the commissioner's ambassador program.
No, it's not, because the labor negotiations of 2020, 2026 into 2027 are not going to hinge on the commissioner's ambassadors program. I will safely declare that today. I do think, look, if Rob proposes a cap, which we expect, and then he backs off of it, he'll probably still get every time you don't give a cap if you're the players, you are still conceding things. It gets tighter and tighter and tighter. Last time it was the Cohen tax. And so even when the owners, it might appear, don't win, they didn't win the last round of bargaining, right? I think most people would say the players, came out with more than the owners did in terms of what they were seeking going into it. And now it's reversed. It's the owners who are going to be the aggressors in this one, the players who are going to be on the defensive. The players can fight off a cap and go, we fought off a cap. But what they're going to end up with is probably something they're going to like a little less, is my guess.
We're going to be able to cover this all throughout. Evan, we're out of time. Thank you for joining us again. Senior writer at The Athletic. Subscribe, read The Athletic, and author. I'd like to say best-selling author. Winning Fixes Everything. If you haven't read that book, read it. Evan, thank you for your time. We will definitely do this again.
Bye, David.